All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming back. And our next speaker...
Not a given.
You all came back to hear Adam's talk, of course. Our next speaker, Adam Leroy, is professor at Ohio State now. And
Almost.
Nearly. And one of the young leaders in the field is particularly on the observational side. And together with a few other people in the last few years has really defined, I think, the observational focus at the interface between galactic scales and traditional ISM scales. And as a result, probably has to get stuck with twice as many conferences and committees as the rest of us. But I think he'll give us an overview of what's happening at the state of the art of the observations in between these scales now. Thank you.
Well, and I'm mostly going to take the scurrilous tack of showing you all what you've done. But so my level here is super ambiguous and broad-reaching, and so I have totally collapsed to the Jonathan solution of there are way too many slides for me to go through. But I tried to I sort of broke things that I thought were interesting within this topic of star formation on galactic scales into 6 slides. This is incredibly observational and incredibly high level. So there's a cajillion slides on this, and I figured if there's a PDF that has a bunch of these slides in it, it's easy to go back to later. But sort of broadly, what I figured I would do is spend 10 minutes on terminology, or maybe 5 to 10 minutes on terminology and sort of framework, a reasonable way to talk about this. Since scales were explicitly included in the conference, I figured I would say a few words about the effect of scale on studying star formation in galaxies, and then I'd sort of written down sort of 4 of these equilibrium formation feedback balances that you attempt to access observationally. So the balance between star formation and H1, particularly in outer disks and dwarf galaxies, the balance between star formation and H2, which is extremely heavily studied at the moment, the balance between H2 and H1, and then this sort of cloud structure, dense gas fraction across the galaxy population, which goes to a lot of and so all of these have been sort of introduced in various ways by Nick and Jonathan already. But so, I like cartoons a lot, and so the starting point for sort of thinking about, for me at least, for thinking about star formation on galactic scales is that this is sort of a fundamentally multi-process, multi-scale, and it's not always the same step in here that is the regulating regime for all parts of the local universe. And so, if you are tracing the secular buildup of a galaxy, as we've heard already this morning, it looks something like this. You access what's now thought to be a very large circumgalactic medium, or access the intergalactic medium to bring gas into a galaxy where it probably shifts from an ionized to a diffuse, mostly atomic phase. You then have, over some parts of the galaxy, preferentially more than other parts of the galaxy, the ISM organized into sort of bound cold star-forming clouds. Within those clouds, there's been an emphasis, particularly in the galactic community, on the fact that it's very specifically the dense gas and perhaps more than just gas density, specific gravitationally bound structures. So this is this whole filament subfield that is actually forming stars. And then, of course, the young stars exert feedback, as do the old stars, on the structure of the galaxy itself, on the ability of all of these different phases to sort of convert to the next one down the chain, right? And so this is, if you take an already vastly oversimplified cartoon and simplify it further, what I would say is that from the perspective of those of us who study this topic observationally, I at least find it convenient to sort of walk around with a chain that's sort of something like this, which sort of links observationally accessible phases and has processes labeled to link between them. So if you imagine that you're sort of thinking about the accretion of gas onto galaxies, that's going to tell you about the balance between the overall ISM and the material outside of galaxies. If you're thinking about the link between the atomic gas that you see in a galaxy and the molecular gas that you see in a galaxy, the sort of mass conservation and cycling arguments in regions where these are comparable are some of the stuff that Nick was talking about. And then, of course, the cloud structure we also saw mentioned in the context of the galactic GMC populations by Nick, where you can imagine that the balance between dense gas and bound cold molecular gas, these may all be functions of environment. And so what I would say is that there are different regimes in here where these processes are important to different parts of the local universe. And so I think it's worth sort of stepping through and noting, so I guess the high-level statement on this should be that there is not one process that you would pick out in here that is the defining process for forming stars and galaxies. So this actually goes to an offhand comment that Nick made at the end of his talk, which is that when people tell you you should just go measure dense gas and galaxies because that's the stuff that forms stars, that completely removes a huge chunk of what you actually need in order to bring gas in from the IGM to actually build a galaxy out of stars. And so the interesting thing is actually to understand all of these and understand which processes represent limiting factors in which regimes. And so if you were not at this conference and you were going to a very heavily galaxy evolution-oriented conference, they would tell you that this is all, in the words of, so I think it's Vanden Bosch who calls this the star formation and ISM is all just weather. So if you zoom out far enough, you don't particularly care that it takes, given a few gigayears or half a gigayear or many gigayears, you don't particularly care if you put gas into galaxies, it'll form stars. So for many folks, this is good enough. If you are particularly interested in the outer disks of galaxies or in dwarf galaxies, what you'll see is that most of the ISM is often kept in the form of the atomic interstellar medium. And once you get bound molecular gas, the time that it takes to form stars, this characteristic sort of gigayear that Nick mentioned, is fast compared to the time scale that you would figure out that it takes you to sort of chew through your atomic ISM. And so this can be interpreted as essentially saying that in this regime, it's cloud formation, or really it's the equilibrium abundance of H2, the balance of cloud formation and destruction, that's the sort of governing regime. And this can be accessed either by comparing the amount of molecular gas to atomic gas, or simply by saying everything that happens after I get molecular gas just leaves me with star formation. And so there's a literature on the ratio of star formation to H1, particularly focused on dwarfs. And there's been a lot of work on this in both the local volume and in the alfalfa survey. So once you get into the inner parts of galaxies, a lot of the gas just stays in the molecular phase, or the fraction of gas in the molecular phase is substantial compared to the atomic mass fraction. And this is the area that's probably seen the most activity in the last few years. So this molecular star formation law, but which is just essentially saying, how does once I get a bound cold molecular cloud, how does the transformation of that cloud into star formation depend on environment as I look at a variety of different systems across the universe? And this is the sort of regulating process for the inner parts of disks and we think high redshift galaxies, which observation success, so the high redshift galaxies that are observationally accessible should really be the rigorous statement, because those tend to appear to be dominated by molecular gas. And then, of course, if you actually want to take extragalactic observations and compare them back to the studies that people do in the Milky Way people, to steal Jonathan's term, would view the molecular cloud itself as sort of boundary conditions. So the star formation the star formation that's actually studied by the Milky Way community happens at very sub-GMC scales. And we've seen a couple of times these plots showing that there's a strong concentration of the actual star formation into the densest parts of a cloud. And so this is the topic that's either probed by, as Nick pointed out, the sort of use of spectroscopic high effective density tracers, or by getting at cloud substructure in the Milky Way. And it's very interesting to try and ask, as we broaden beyond, essentially these studies have focused, the Milky Way studies that have done the structural analysis of the sort of dense gas and filaments have essentially focused on the nearest 500 parsecs. And as we try and get a broader environmental view, linking other galaxies back to this, I think, is particularly interesting. And then, of course, you can also phrase this as, given environment in a galaxy, I have some cold, dense molecular phase. How does the actual structure within that phase depend on context? How does it depend on the galaxy that I'm looking at? How are molecular clouds different in a starburst than they are in a disk? And so essentially, what's my balance of dense star-forming material to overall star-forming material as I look around the local universe? So this sort of Russian doll model, so I would argue that this sort of Russian doll model is a kind of useful cartoon to keep in your head as you're sort of looking at studies of star formation and the ISM in galaxies sort of across the universe. Right? It's not that any one of these processes is the magic process across all regimes, but as you sort of think about different scales, then you'll see different ones of these processes jumping up to the fore as essentially the limiting reagent. So, I mentioned this a couple of times, but the balance of getting your diffuse atomic gas into a dense molecular phase is very important in dwarfs in the outer disks of galaxies. In the inner disks of galaxies and starbursts, the substructure within your molecular gas, the physical conditions within the molecular gas may have a lot to say about the rate at which you form stars. And if you want to link back to the Milky Way, the connection to cloud substructure needs to be made, because essentially this is the defining, this is, at least for many of the current subfields, this is sort of the defining character of the studies that they're pursuing. So the way, and I will sort of zip through this, but the way that we've pursued these observationally, and where we is sort of broadly talking about the community over the last few years, is that over the last couple decades, it's become possible to observe either whole galaxies or parts of galaxies across many parts of the spectrum, where you can essentially access many different phases within this sort of schematic diagram and compare them to one another as a way to sort of constrain physical processes. And this has turned out to be a fruitful way to think about things. And I guess I will just, since I'm burning my time a little bit on methodology here, but I guess I'll say that the way that I think is particularly fruitful, or at least the way that I feel like I get some insight out of this, is to specifically think about breaking apart either taking populations of galaxies or taking big parts of galaxies and thinking about what I guess I would call ISM colors or physical colors or something like that. So you'll see a lot of sort of scaling relations, mass-mass plots, sigma-sigma plots. Those are absolutely fine ways to plot observations, but I feel like the physical insight often comes from quantities like this. So you can argue for a long time about what you should call these things, but essentially the normalized ratio of things like the star formation rate per unit H2, or the fraction of the ISM that's sitting in a molecular phase, or the fraction of the H2 that's sitting above some particular density. Or as I mentioned before, this star formation rate per unit H1 in dwarfs and the outer disks of galaxies would tell you how good the overall ISM is at forming stars. And specifically what's productive about this is that these quantities are intrinsically normalized. They're intensive quantities, right? They're relatively scale independent, which even surface densities really are not. So, I mean, for those of you who are observational, you have a strong handle on the fact that if you go from the molecular clouds that Nick is talking about to the scales of whole galaxies, that you're not directly accessing the physical surface density of the molecular clouds when you plot a galactic surface density. So these are also natural theoretical predictions. And then the other point that I guess I'd want to make about these is that it's easy, and I'm certainly as guilty of this as anybody, to talk about things like the H2 to H1 ratio is about cloud formation. So these really aren't. They're about the balance between formation and destruction. So they encode both feedback and formation processes inside of them. And so they're natural predictions for theories that, like Jonathan was talking about, sort of predict a quasi-equilibrium in star-forming systems. And so I don't know that I will go through these and spend a ton of time on this, but the point that I would want to make is that there's actually a lot of ways to sort of very naturally express a lot of the current ideas that people will talk about in terms of these sorts of quantities, right? And so, the classic expression of this is that the star formation rate per unit total gas depends on the average surface density of gas across the system. I think that is, at least to me, a more constructive way to phrase the Kennecott-Schmidt law that everyone plots. Jonathan talked about the idea of the star formation per unit gas having a first-order dependence on the orbital time, which is something that a lot of folks have talked about and tested and either said is true or not over the last few years. Things like, just sort of bouncing through here, so things like saying that the star formation per unit gas primarily depends on the density, the under-the-hood volume density of the gas is a very reasonable way to express the freefall time dependence that Jonathan brought up as this idea of sort of a fixed efficiency per freefall time. And it sort of goes on, and a bunch of you have had versions of, have had ideas that can be expressed in this way. I hope either tomorrow or the next day, Sharon will talk to us about the star formation rate per unit molecular gas having a dependence on local sort of Bernoulli-style pressure. Jonathan already mentioned to us the star formation per unit H2 mass potentially depending on shear, and Nick also brought up the idea that you could calculate a local cloud collision rate, perhaps as a dependence on spiral arms. There's a natural prediction here. So I think that this is a productive way to talk about this, and hopefully, so I guess what I'd like to, having burned far too much time on this, like what I think a useful way to talk to each other about these kinds of processes as we sort of talk across this week is to, to think about this sort of Russian doll model of there are multiple scales here, there are different regimes in the local galaxy population and across the universe where different processes represent the limiting step. A useful way to sort of talk across scales and across and to relate theory back to observations is to think about these intensive quantities and think about how sort of current theoretical ideas can be expressed in this way. So that's a far too long methodological, I don't think that was a rant, but I think that I think that reading plots, even when they're not plotted in this way, gives us a very clear way to talk about the physics that are actually going on. So hopefully that's useful for our discussions this week. So my assignment was also to talk about galactic scales, and this also comes back to this question of sort of the evolution of an individual GMC. And so when we think about how we relate these processes to observations of individual star-forming regions in the Milky Way, or the evolution of a single giant molecular cloud, I do want to make just what's essentially an observational point. And really what I want to do is be like the 9th person to show the sort of beautiful torus map. But so we are now getting into the regime with ALMA, the VLA, or simply in-depth studies of the local group, where the distinction between galactic and extragalactic studies can get a little bit blurred. And so one of the reasons that it's nice to actually put things at a distance and study whole galaxies put together, or to have your physical resolution be a few kiloparsecs, is that when we look at an actual galaxy, we see it resolve in individual molecular clouds, individual H2 regions. And when we talk about one of these sort of equilibrium ratios of, say, star formation to H2 or H2 to H1, we are interested in how these depend in quasi-equilibrium on local physical conditions. In fact, if you get to the point where you are isolating an individual region, I think there's reasonable observational evidence that regardless of what happens to the actual gas, we do see star-forming regions in distinct evolutionary states. So that, for example, to show a couple of plots, if you look at M33, then you see individual H2 regions and individual molecular clouds. There are better versions of the map on the right now, but essentially you see as opposed to seeing a blurred out distribution of molecular gas or a blurred out distribution of where you think star formation might be occurring, you're seeing individual regions in individual evolutionary states. And if you plot where the sort of bright H alpha is in blue, or the bright CO is in red, when you get this at a few tens of parsecs resolution, these are simply not at the same place. And if you want a even more beautiful version of this, and so I have to give the torus is beautiful, but for me at least, this is work by Sharon, Ava Schinnerer, and many others. This is the PDBI version of the M51 CO map. So for me, this is the most beautiful extragalactic, certainly radio image that I've seen. And if you make an analogous plot where you just go do the image analysis thing, take the top 10% of H alpha intensities and the top 10% of CO intensities, this is, resolution has created the problem for you that you don't see these things in the same place anymore. And so this has been seen before, particularly in the LMC, but there's you essentially are running into the fact that the evolution of individual regions is now occurring at your resolution scale. And so you need to blur this out at some level. Otherwise, your access to this sort of quasi-equilibrium state does not exist. The converse of this, and there's been nice theoretical work on this by Robert Feldman and Diederik Cruyssen, is that you can potentially access the evolution of these individual regions with sophisticated enough modeling and a deep understanding of your observational tracers by using these very high resolution data. And so an example of this that we did extremely crudely in M33 was to imagine placing progressively bigger apertures on the peaks within the galaxy and watching how you moved back to recover what you might think was the equilibrium sort of star formation per unit H2 as these apertures got bigger, but see that if you focused on a GMC or an H2 region at very high resolution, then the answer depended very strongly on where you had placed your aperture, which is, there are a number of possible explanations, but an easy one for this is simply that individual regions look very different as a function of time on the sort of, typical sort of crossing time or H2 region evolution time for a GMC. So I'm going to gloss over this, but want to call out, so particularly Guillermo got a lot of work started in this direction. So you can access the same information potentially by simply looking at scatter within these intensive quantities as a function of the scale that you've observed. And this requires This can be fairly interpretational, but it does mean that the jitter between, say, how much do I have a lot of H2 relative to H1, is the scatter in that quantity very high if I look at a particular resolution? Does that tell me something about the cycling, even when you're looking at unresolved maps? Does that tell me something about the cycling of gas between phases? This is very smooth, this is very jittery. And I should also point out that there's actually, so before all of this, the Nanten group in particular studying the LMC has recognized the power of sort of resolving individual molecular clouds with an external view and attempting to sort of understand the evolutionary state of the gas in these galaxies for a long time. And there's an excellent series of papers that even goes so far as to do things like include the accreting H1 onto the clouds. And they have there's an interesting emergent picture from that. I will gloss over this except to say that surface density is not conserved across scales. So although it is a nice pseudo-intensive quantity, you do not have a strong expectation that if you measure a surface density at sort of kiloparsec resolution, that has told you about the surface density of individual clouds beneath the resolution. OK, so blazing through and so, I mean, the idea here is just to give you guys a very high-level overview. Hopefully, so A, if you have anything to say, you should say it. And B, hopefully some of this will hook as potentially interesting for follow-up discussion. So this is sort of conclusion. Since I've said these, I will skip over. And then I'll kind of step you through in the last few minutes some of the main observational results that I think we kind of know about the balances between these different phases. So as a reminder, so I'm first going to talk about the balance between atomic gas and young stars. And as a reminder, so we do think that stars form in molecular gas. This is not the fact that we're comparing atomic gas and star formation doesn't mean that we're positing that there are cores made of H1. But what we do know is that if you look at a typical spiral and then you look at a typical dwarf, and specifically if you make radial profiles of the distribution of the ISM phases here in a dwarf on the top and a spiral galaxy in the bottom, then we know that in blue, so you're looking at the atomic gas mass profile, we know that dwarfs tend to have ISMs that are dominated by atomic gas. And we know that the outer parts of galaxies tend to have ISMs that are dominated by atomic gas. So as Nick pointed out earlier, a lot of the stars form in the inner parts of the spiral galaxy, where most of the gas is molecular. But a lot of the ISM mass is actually kept in the outer parts. And in fact, if you sort of write this down with a very, very crude exponential, you would say maybe about half the stars form in the molecular dominated regime in a typical spiral, and maybe about half the stars form outside that. And in any of these regimes where atomic gas dominates the ISM, comparing the rate of star formation to the overall ISM mass tells you essentially how good that system is at forming stars out of its ISM. And I think Janice is not here, right? She may be. So eventually we should, if she does show up this week, we should ambush her with questions, because I think so what I would say is there's actually been a lot of work spurred by both the local volume legacy and the alfalfa survey in various manifestations, comparing the H1 to star formation rate in integrated samples of galaxies spanning a range of masses. And so the upshot on this that I would take away from these studies is that there appears to be a mass-dependent star formation per unit H1 in galaxies with H1-dominated masses, and the sense of it is that the higher the mass of the galaxy in stars or H1, the higher your efficiency of converting that H1 to stars. The literature does not appear to agree at a fairly substantial level in what this overall normalization of the H1 casted as an H1 depletion time is. So there are certainly the difference between very small dwarfs, which can have apparently depletion times of order of Hubble time, and spirals, which will often have H1 depletion times of 3 to 4 gigayears, makes some sense. But even in studies of dwarf galaxies, it would be interesting to explore a little bit the degree to which apparently distinct studies of the star formation per unit H1 disagree. So this makes a degree of sense in the sense that we know that dwarfs tend to have very extended distributions of gas with weaker stellar potential wells. Feedback should be stronger in these systems. And so the smaller, more tenuous your galaxy is, and the more it's just a ball of gas, the more difficult it should be to bring that gas to high densities and form stars. And so sort of stepping through, so another expression of this is very nice work. So I just point out here that because of alfalfa and the combination of alfalfa and SDSS, this is probably the topic on which you have the best number statistics for whole galaxies, so where people can plot thousands to tens of thousands of whole galaxies. And so there is actually an excellent benchmark for theories that want to treat, for example, metallicity or mass-dependent conversion of H1 into H2 and then star formation in H2 to benchmark against, presuming the normalization works out. And then, so this is out of alfalfa, paper by Wang et al., the star formation per unit H1. And this is just pointing out this sort of 10 gigayears, which to some approximation is the Hubble time, is not an uncharacteristic time that it would take star formation to chew through the H1 reservoir, even independent of accretion, for large populations of low mass galaxies. So there are sort of two resolving, so I mean, you can also resolve galaxies, and you resolve dwarfs, and you resolve outer disks, and this has not been done for tens of thousands of galaxies. This has been done for sort of dozens of galaxies, and I'm showing versions from our surveys here, but there's also very nice work by Isha Begum and Ted Weider and folks like that. And this is just saying that, so when you look within a galaxy, what appears to be very, very important is the local stellar potential well. So this is showing you the star formation per unit H1 inside a couple dozen galaxies from the Thing survey. And what you see is that inside, this is essentially inside 1.2 times the optical radius, and you see that inside that, the star formation per unit H1 depends very, very clearly on the stellar surface density, and so you would argue on the structure of the galactic disk and potential well, while the correlation with the overall gas reservoir is existing but extraordinarily steep, implying very, very sensitive. This picture changes a little bit as you go way out into the disks of galaxies, where this is from work by Frank Begiel. This is the star formation per unit H1 in the outer parts, the far outer parts of galaxies, as a function of H1 surface density. And what you see is that with enormous scatter, the star formation per unit H1 tracks the H1 surface density, so that you would, if you plotted these as a surface density power law, you're getting something close to quadratic. But what it says is that as you accumulate more gas in the outer parts of galaxies where this dominates the potential well, then the efficiency with which you're converting that gas to stars actually goes up. And you see that in both spirals and dwarf galaxies. So I'm going to, since I'm blazing through my time at a prodigious rate, I'm going to keep bouncing along and not read you conclusions. But again, if anybody has anything to say, you should shout, or you can shout all week. So obviously, the topic that I feel like you've almost certainly all seen many more results on than any other in the last few years, and this is largely, I would say, because the light is good here, is the relationship between molecular gas and young stars. This is partially motivated by the fact that you see a more direct correlation between the molecular gas and star formation than you do between the atomic gas and star formation. But it's also simply because our telescopes for observing highly resolved molecular gas across a range of redshifts are simply better than our ability to observe the atomic gas. So I think there are fascinating physics still buried in the atomic gas that we simply can't get at right now. But that's sort of wandering into footnotes. So very broadly, what I would say is that there's an overall agreement coming back to this sort of characteristic timescale that Nick mentioned, that if you look at local blue disk galaxies, then you see them chew through their molecular gas in order a gigayear. Could be a factor of a couple higher, could be a little bit lower, depending on the exact calibration of the tracers that you're using. But this is my attempt to sort of pull all of the literature together as of a couple of years ago. And there are substantial disagreements on how to draw lines through this, but I would say that what you don't see is substantial disagreements in sort of where you're dropping things in this parameter space, right? Like, there's a lot of spread here, and I'll show you in the next few slides. It's fascinating spread, but overall, people come out to the sort of order gigayear when you look at the sort of boring population of star-forming galaxies. So a version of that expressed as sort of one of these scaling relations looks something like this for our Heracles CO 2-to-1 versus star formation sample. And this is super boring and is just essentially tells you that in sort of a similar collection of big blue disk galaxies, you see about the same star formation rate once you know how much molecular gas you have. Fortunately, so people, some including us, but especially including the cold gas team, and I'll show you some results from Sharon, have managed to look at this with a broader view and tease out interesting physics within this. And I'll come back and caveat this a little bit because this is still your histogram. But if you weight this relationship instead of by sort of local individual lines of sight, you weight the galaxy, you weight the same plot by, so that you have equal weighting per galaxy. And what you see is that, so low metallicity dwarf galaxies have a higher rate of star formation per unit CO. Starbursts, which has absolutely been known for a long time, decades and decades, have a higher apparent rate of star formation per unit CO. And so there are variations inside the molecular gas per unit star formation. And we're finally sort of at the point where we're able to access some of these physics. And this is the sort of next few slides are very staccato because I'm going to sort of point out one variation, then a different variation, then a different variation, as opposed to sewing them all together into a beautiful picture. But I'd say there's a few senses of these that are interesting to keep in mind as we go through this. So the first one is that the centers of galaxies appear to act differently than the disks of galaxies. So the centers of galaxies show a wide distribution of star formation per unit gas. This depends strongly on what you think about the CO to H2 conversion factor, which is absolutely a topic to sort of chew each other up over in a working group, but not now. But what you see here is you see a very wide distribution in the inner parts of our sort of 30 Heracles galaxies. If you turn this into histograms, sort of plotting the H2 depletion time, so the H2 mass divided by the star formation rate for the cold gas, which I would say is the most complete unresolved sample of atomic and molecular gas and star formation in galaxies, are resolved sort of, so 1 kiloparsec resolution, then looking specifically at the centers in purple here, and then looking at the starbursts, which I will say as an aside, are still in desperate need of a thorough compilation of sort of what the local galaxy starbursts look like in molecular gas. So we're still leaning very heavily on early 90s work on this. So you see a histogram that looks something like this. So you have kind of this characteristic gig a year for the resolved galaxies and the unresolved galaxies. A very wide dispersion, so that different galaxies do different things. And this may very well have something to do with bars and pseudo-bulges and bulges. There's good evidence sort of correlating back to that for the centers of galaxies, and then, of course, very low depletion times for the starbursts. This slide simply shows that this depends fairly strongly on what you do with the conversion factor, but the direction of the signal is the same. And so if we want the hook, the potential hook here is to the sort of two sequences discussion that's gone on, particularly informed by the addition of high redshift galaxies to this plot, where you see a similar thing, but the high redshift galaxies enter in essentially showing similar depletion times to the local disk galaxies with an asterisk, but at surface densities that are comparable to the starburst galaxies. And so this has led to a lot of discussion of the orbital time as a potential driver. So I would say that one thing that is there are probably two additional trends that are worth carrying out of here. So, and I think this is something that came very nicely out of work by Amélie Santange in the cold gas survey, is that there's a very strong observational trend in the star formation per unit H2. It's not an enormous spread, but the star formation per unit H2 as a function of stellar mass. So it took their very nice sort of successor to the NRAO extragalactic survey to see this rigorously. But that's in these sort of blue points in the background here. There's a nice correlation in the sense that the more massive your galaxy, the longer the apparent H2 depletion time. So the more H2 you have relative to your star formation rate. So there's also, this sort of also extends into early type galaxies, like real early type galaxies. This is work by the Atlas 3D team led by Tim Davis, which shows you in red that the early type galaxies show lower star formation. Again, just think of this in the ratio space as opposed to the sort of scaling space. The star formation per unit H2 in the Atlas 3D early type galaxies, and this is also work by Katie Alatello and Lisa Young, is lower than the star formation rate per unit H2 in the sort of normal spiral galaxies. The other important trend here, though, is this, and this actually goes back to work by Young et al. In the NRAO extragalactic survey. So the other important trend here is that it's not just a correlation with stellar mass. As you go to the dwarfs in particular, you see very high star formation per unit CO. And you can cast this very cleanly as a correlation with either metallicity or probably more physically dust to gas ratio, which is something that we have access to via Herschel at this point. And if you do that, then these points here, which have very high star formation per unit CO and low dust to gas ratios, a very reasonable explanation for this is that you're essentially looking at CO to H2 conversion factor effects. And so I'm not going to step through the sort of detailed PDR structure, but I think that this is an important, so in addition to the sort of why do very massive galaxies, why do very massive galaxies not form as many stars per unit CO, which may get into sort of the physics of diffuse molecular phases, the apparently very high star formation per unit CO in low mass galaxies probably has a lot to do with PDR structure and the selective suppression of CO emission relative to H2, but this is actually something that's very hard to tease apart because these points sit in the middle of an overwhelmingly atomic ISM, and teasing apart the physical state of the atomic ISM or even the local dust to gas ratio that you should use, it can be very challenging, but it's something that needs a lot of work. So in the 0 time that I have, I want to point out, I want to call out something that I think is also not necessarily intuitively obvious, which is that even when we say there's a beautiful scaling, so this is M51. I know it doesn't look like M51, but if you think back to all the beautiful plots that Nick showed, here's your arm coming up and around and then coming down and over this way. And you plot the IR as a function of CO for each of a whole bunch of 800 parsec points in M51. So over here, you've got what you would call just a beautiful scaling relation, and we're done and we're going to move on. But if you plot that ratio as a function of spatial location, something that Sharon has done and shown very nicely is that this isn't random. So even if you have a beautiful factor of 2 scatter, if you're happy with the factor of 2 scatter, then you can call this the bathtub model for molecular gas and you can move on. But there are physics buried in this. And specifically what Sharon noticed is that there's very low IR to CO ratios even when you have very high atomic surface densities. So basically those points over there on the high CO side, but very low IR to CO ratio, don't seem like they should be sitting there. So why, she'll show you more of this, I'm sure, on Wednesday. But what she was able to do is connect this back to local dynamics and in general come up with a scenario which should move your sort of IR to CO ratio, even within something that looks like a boring scaling relation, move this substantially, and it's systematic and it's physical, right? And so the neat thing is that we were actually at the point where we can get at this. I'm going to gloss over this, but I think it's worth maybe coming back to, which is that one of the most often cited cold gas results is the relationship between the specific star formation rate per unit stellar mass and the specific star formation rate per unit gas mass. Obviously, these are highly correlated axes, but it's also the strongest correlation that they find. I think, but would be interested, as we talk this week, to hear other people. So I think that the easiest expression of this is that apparent variations in the specific star formation rate per unit stellar mass are likely driven by physical variations in the gas, in how good the gas is at forming stars. But this is not the universal interpretation of this, and it would be interesting to hear what people think. All right, so I think I should probably, I have no idea the clock is doing crazy things. I think I should probably stop here. I want to point out that, just so I showed Orion, just like everybody else, but I want to point out the potential other axis that would be interesting to talk about this week. I won't step through the results, but is that our knowledge of extragalactic giant molecular clouds is way better than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. We now have many systems, and this is sort of from a paper that should be out this week, but driven by the PAUSE survey, but also the karma surveys that Nick mentioned, in addition to targeted local group surveys, and now ALMA, we know a lot more about the star-forming structures across the local universe than we did, and we're knowing more sort of every week or month. And so connecting these back to these integrated, I mean, this is a point that was essentially explicitly made by Nick, but connecting these back to the integrated sort of how good is the ISM at forming stars is a really powerful way to both bridge the gap between Milky Way star formation and whole galaxies and generalize Milky Way results. But it's also, there's a number of theories that essentially would lay the sort of physics of molecular clouds at the center of how good you are at forming stars overall. So Jonathan mentioned these turbulence-regulated theories, which make predictions for things like Mach number, density, stuff like that. These should be moving into the observationally testable regime at this point. So we've done a little of this in NGC 253, which is a nice extreme case. But overall, I think this is a very productive direction to head forward in. that's essentially what I got. There's a lot in here on dense gas tracers too, which I think is another area that is becoming vastly more accessible because our sensitivity has gotten so much better. And I think the picture is substantially more complicated, essentially as Nick said, than a lot of picture has made it out to be. But I think that's something we can talk about during the week. All right, thank you. Sorry.